faba bean is a very versatile feed ingredient, but first is it's a legume. So as a legume, we got into it because of its environmental benefits, and one of them is that it likely reduces the contribution of crops to greenhouse emissions.
Welcome to the Swine Canada podcast show, brought to you by 𝗺𝗻. So we are dedicated to bringing you the latest insights and discussions in the Canadian pork industry. So my name is Miranda Smith, and I'll be the host for today's episode. And with me today, I have Dr. Eduardo Beltranena. And I'm actually really excited to have him on the show today, because not everyone may know, but Eduardo and I used to work together for over 7 years when we were still working for the Alberta government together. So welcome to the show, Eduardo.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Pleasure to be part of the show.
And so today we're going to talk about feeding faba beans to pigs. So I'm, again, excited about this topic because we did some of this research in chickens when we were still working together. But then as you moved to the University of Alberta and I moved to Prairie Swine Centre, you continued this research in pigs. So, but before we go and talk about that, can you first do a little bit of an introduction of yourself?
Well, I was born in Guatemala and moved fairly young, moved to Mexico, where I did my undergraduate degree in ag engineering. And at the end of that, I stay in Mexico and work for the swine industry. I was also for the poultry industry. I was working as a farm manager. And for a 𝗬𝗀 sow operation, we also had crops. And so I was quite involved with both production of sorghum and pigs. And I was also doing some layer and broiler trials in parallel in the poultry industry. After that, I moved to Canada and to do my master's, and then ended with a PhD in nutrition reproduction interactions. And after that, I worked for the feed industry as a feed mill nutritionist and in product development just south of Edmonton at Kalmar Feed Mill. I was doing a lot of dairy work as well as pig and beef nutrition. From there, I went for a sabbatical leave to Kansas State University, and I was hired there to go to Prairie Swine Centre, where I was the manager of contract research services. So providing all kinds of research services to the pharmaceutical and feed industry, including GLP and GCP trials. After that, we moved back to Alberta, and I was working for the Alberta government for about 15 years. And that's where we met, I guess, working there. And then the government decided to get out of research, so my position was moved to the University of Alberta, and I was there for about 3-4 years, and I was teaching as well as doing research, and just towards the end of 2022, a position became available here at North Carolina State University, and I applied for it, and I got it. So now I am very involved in extension. About 75% of my position is extension, about 20% is research, and 5% is other things. But that's kind of the breakdown of what I'm doing now.
Okay, perfect. And so, as I mentioned before, today we'll talk about feeding faba beans. So, like the last time when we talked about faba beans, you called faba beans the Cinderella crop. So, can you start by talking about why do you call it the Cinderella crop?
Well, faba bean is a very versatile feed ingredient, but first is it's a legume. So as a legume, um, we got into it because of its environmental benefits, and one of them is that it likely reduces the contribution of crops to greenhouse emissions. All legumes are characterized by having an association with bacteria in their roots, and this rhizobium bacteria capture nitrogen and carbon from the atmosphere for plant utilization. And especially on the nitrogen side, this spares the application of nitrogen fertilizers and even manure. These plants don't need to be fertilized with nitrogen fertilizers, and thus it reduces the soil acidification quite a bit. It also reduces nitrogen leaching into water bodies, either by runout or by running out into lakes or rivers, runoff from rain. It also prevents the evaporization of nitrogen into the atmosphere, and that also can be, that nitrogen comes back to the soil in the form of rain. So legumes tend to reduce the emission of gaseous nitrogen compounds, and specifically nitrous oxide. Why are we concerned about nitrous oxide? Because it's 280 times worse than CO2 in global warming potential. Methane is only 28 times worse than CO2 in global warming potential, but nitrous oxide is between 260 and 300 times worse than CO2 in global warming potential. So by having legumes, we minimize nitrogen fertilizers, we minimize that volatilization of nitrogenous compounds into the atmosphere. Another great thing about pulses that are low-fat legumes is their dual nutrient content, and in this we're referring to starch and protein. And they also provide fiber for human nutrition and for animal nutrition. But in Canada, we export a lot of these pulses to the Mediterranean regions, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and so we contribute to the nutrition of human race by doing so. But pulp production can be prioritized for humans, but any surplus or low quality grain can be directed to animal feeding. Thus, we tend to reduce the food chain waste streams, and we enhance the circularity of agricultural production by doing so. One of the characteristics of faba bean is that is the legume that fixates the most nitrogen from any of the annual legume crops. So it captures the most. It captures nitrogen from the time the plant gets established all the way to until the plant gets desiccated or dies. And so it fixates nitrogen throughout. While, for example, field pea will only fixate nitrogen when it's from the blooming season on. Another great advantage on the crop side of faba bean is that it is not as susceptible as field pea to some of the root rot diseases that affect field pea. And so in there we have 𝗟𝗶𝗀𝗃𝗃 and some of the diseases caused by Fusarium, as well as Aphanomyces and Rhizoctonia. But faba is less susceptible to root rot than field pea. So especially on the black soils and the gray soils of the prairie provinces, faba bean is more suited than, for example, for the brown soils and light brown soils of the southern prairies, which are drier, and that's where field peas probably has more advantage to it. So those are kind of the most important ones in terms of why is a Cinderella crop.
Okay, so there's a lot of advantages to growing faba bean, obviously. So now let's look at the nutritional aspects if we want to feed faba beans to pigs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
One thing that probably nutritionists are very focused on, but producers are not, is the starch content. And pulses provide both starch and protein. So many think that field pea and faba bean are protein sources. Well, they are, but that's kind of secondary role. Their first role is that they do contribute starch and to the diets, and in there they compete with cereals. So cereals will have about 60% starch, but faba bean has as much as 45% starch. Field pea will have a slightly more starch but lower protein. Meanwhile, faba bean has about a higher content of protein compared to field pea. So we're looking kind of at 45% faba bean starch compared to field pea that has about 50%. But we're looking about 28 to 30% protein compared to about 20 to 23% protein in field pea. So it contributes a bit more nutrients in that role to monogastric diets that would be the pigs and poultry.
And then what about inclusion rates? Like what kind of inclusion rates would you recommend for the different growth phases?
Well, inclusion rates of faba bean can be very high, but it's not optimal. Like how much faba bean can you feed to a pig or to a broiler? You can feed 100%, but it is not ideal. Okay. Is there any effect on feed intake? Yes, there is some, as there's also some anti-nutritional factors. But probably inclusion rates can be relatively high. I would say to about 30% of the diet. Then some of the nutrients become less cost effective, and we start getting into some of the amino acids that are in a lower content in faba bean become limiting, and then probably about 30% is kind of the max that we should add in both poultry and pig diets. Then some of the other amino acids that, for example, soybean meal, canola meal can provide at a lower cost then become more important. There is not much difference between what the inclusion should be for wean pigs versus grow out or grower finisher pigs or sows. So basically, this 30% upper limit is kind of more or less what we try not to go over. One other thing that I think is very important is to do a phase-in introduction of any feedstuffs, and faba bean is not different. So, for example, in phase 1 diets, we will use like 10% in nursery and then go to a 20%, and then go to a 30%, and then you can sustain that if it's cost effective, obviously. But because pulses have this dual content of starch and protein, they tend to step into the diet. They tend to be priced into the diets a bit sooner than some of the cereal grains and protein sources like soybean meal, canola.
Okay. So one of the things that I was really interested in when we were doing our research with the chickens, and which you then repeated in the pigs, is looking at frost-damaged faba beans. So faba bean is somewhat susceptible to early frost. So, like, if this happens and the crop gets damaged, can we still feed it?
Yes, and in cool temperate climate regions with a short cropping season, pulse production can be adversely affected by frost. And faba bean, as compared to field pea, can be a bit more tolerant to frost. But we're more concerned with this recurrent nighttime frost that can halt maturation of the faba bean, resulting in greener, softer cotyledons and blackened hulls, which obviously diminish visual appearance. So they're not that good for human consumption because they're blackened. And that is a key factor in the acceptance for human food. Blackened beans are heavily discounted because they look damaged. But we have demonstrated that it is quite feasible to feed these frost-damaged faba beans to both broilers and pigs. And like working with you, we showed that the unmature faba bean had greater digestibility than the undamaged faba beans for broilers, and it was substantial advantage in terms of digestibility with broilers. We did not have exactly the same results with pigs, but we did show that it was not affecting the pigs negatively to feed frost-damaged faba bean. Since we work with that material that we had produced at CDC North, I did further work in pigs with faba bean, and we focused on material that came out from the same field, but this time we went with the optical scanners. And optical sorting, it's a must if you have frost-damaged faba bean. And you have to understand how frost affects the crop. And you have to understand that most likely when you have a field that is affected by frost damage, it is not evenly. And so what happens when frost comes is it tends to affect the plants primarily at the top. And at the top of faba bean is where you have the immature developing pods that are still green. And they're going to be affected by frost. And especially in Alberta, we tend to have, on the prairie provinces, we tend to have these mild frosts in the wintertime or near harvest time, where it's not a deep frost, but it affects the top of the plants more. Because the bottom of the plants, they already have mature pods. They already turning brown. The seed inside those pods is already mature. And there's a microclimate at the bottom of the crop. So you have heat trap between plants. And you also have heat that it is by convection coming out of the soil and keeping those pods nice and toasty during the frost at the top. So you'll tend to have very good quality faba bean at the bottom of the plant. Meanwhile, at the top, you'll have green, even mushy beans but immature beans and reduced size at the top. So what we discovered with the optical scanners was that we could segregate those beans. We could segregate the nice tan faba beans and sell them for human consumption because they were coming from the bottom of the plant. And then we segregated the blackened, immature beans, and we were able to feed that to pigs. And as before, feeding those frost-damaged fava beans to broilers, exactly the same thing. It did not affect growth performance, feed efficiency, feed intake in pigs. So it was just, again, a remarkable confirmation in pigs of what happened with broilers. But in broilers, we have had a bit higher digestibility. But in pigs, we didn't get the higher digestibility, but we did get no effect on feed intake, growth performance, getting to feeding the blackened faba bean that we have separated from the good stuff that we saw for human consumption.
So this is really a good story, because it really means that even if you get some damage from the frost, you can still sell it for animal feed and get some money for your crop. And it's a good news story for the pork producers, because they have access to this local ingredient at a reasonable price.
And then there is an anti-nutritional factor for both poultry and pigs, and that is tannins. Tannins are mostly concentrated on the cover of the seed, on the hull of the seed, and they do reduce protein and starch digestibility. However, they also contribute to protection during frost time. They tend to provide an anti-icing effect that reduces the effect of frost on the crop, on the fava bean grain. So we have now evaluated feeding tannin content fava bean and zero tannin cultivars, and we're quite fascinated by it, because we're still able to pick up some differences in digestibility due to the tannin content in fava bean. There is a slight reduction in digestibility, probably, but the difference between tannin content and non-tannin content is not huge. It will reduce the digestibility like 2%. I mean, it's minor effect. When we were working together at Alberta Agriculture, we did a study where we fed 𝗺𝗃 faba bean to chickens, and in order to remove that hull tannins, and it was not effective. The chickens told us it wasn't important. We went to pigs. We fed the 𝗺𝗃 faba bean, and with tannins, and the pigs told us yes. Please hold the fava bean for me. But it is not clear whether it was a tannin effect or by the hulling we reduced fiber content. So it was probably more of an effect on fiber content than the tannin content, because we have fed both whole fava bean, mid tannin and zero tannin, and the difference is only about 2%. So it's the tannin effects on fava bean are overblown from the literature. They're not as strong as they were purported to be.
So on this topic of cultivars then, so what would you recommend for producers that grow and feed their own? So like, I know this is especially for 𝗺𝗃 colonies the case. Like what would be the best cultivars for them to grow and feed?
In a study in 2023, we evaluated 9 different cultivars, and they were the latest that were just coming out. So by now, probably many of them are more commercially available than they were back in 2023. Zero-tannin cultivars we evaluated were CVC 219-6, and that's a cultivar from Glenn Vandenberg from the University of Saskatchewan. And then that was the only cultivar that was high in 𝗙𝗎𝑐𝑖𝑛 and 𝗺𝗏𝑖𝑐𝑖𝑛, which is another anti-nutritional factor that affects humans that have a genetic deficiency for an enzyme in their blood cells that causes them anemia. Of all the 9 cultivars we tested in 2023, only that one from the University of Saskatchewan had high 𝗙𝗎𝑐𝑖𝑛 and 𝗺𝗏𝑖𝑐𝑖𝑛. All the others are now double zero, or there were zero-tannins and zero-tannin and tannin cultivars, but they were all low on 𝗙𝗎𝑐𝑖𝑛 and 𝗺𝗏𝑖𝑐𝑖𝑛. So the zero-tannins cultivars that we evaluated was, again, CVC 219-16. We evaluated DL 197202, another cultivar called DL Nevado and Navy. The mid-tannin cultivars we evaluated were Victus, Fabel that you and I had worked with before, and Doses, and another one called Allison. The results on those cultivars were very encouraging. Very high starch content, above 45%, and above 28% protein. So very good stuff. The digestibility of dry matter gross energy was about 10% greater in zero-tannin cultivars, and the energy values were as well. So there was a bit of an advantage for feeding the zero-tannin cultivars compared to the tannin cultivars. But if you were, for example, planting the tannin cultivars to get the insurance protection from the tannins, you can easily remove that by dehulling. And So in conclusion, despite there is lower starch and greater fiber content, the novel low 𝗙𝗎𝑐𝑖𝑛 and low 𝗺𝗏𝑖𝑐𝑖𝑛 zero-tannin cultivars had a bit more digestibility of dry matter, gross energy, and energy values. In terms of protein and amino acid digestibility, they were kind of slightly greater, but they were very close to the tannin cultivars. And from the zero-tannin cultivars, I think Nevado was the best. DL Nevado was the best, and that came from stamped seeds in Manitoba. And mid-tannin was Doses. Doses was the best, and that came from stamped seeds in Lethbridge.
So it sounds like they cannot really go wrong. Like whichever cultivar they choose, like it will basically work.
Yes, it will basically work. So on the digestibility values are kind of near there. Zero tannins are a little better if you're not dehulling, but if you're dehulling, well, no problem. Both are good. So it just becomes kind of a test as to what would yield more in your area and under your own agronomic conditions.
And I guess the pork producers should just work with a nutritionist to make sure that they know what they have in their ingredients, what nutritional value they have, and work that way.
Yes, a nutritionist should know that we have all the digestibility coefficients for energy values, fermentability, all those coefficients, as well as we have all the amino acid digestibility coefficients, so that they can reach out to me and we can provide that directly. And that will soon be published in Animal Feed Science and Technology, and so the cultivars will be public then, the digestibility values. But for now, they can reach out to me and I can provide that matrix.
So then one last question would be, like, cost-wise, when is it most profitable to feed faba beans versus other feed commodities?
It's all relative to what the price is relative to other commodities. And what's the demand? Like faba bean and 𝗪𝗀 are now being separated, fractionated into protein and starch fractions. And some of those fractions are being directed to different industries, even the human food industry. So according to how the market goes for those fractions, price of faba bean can go up. However, it's also relative to the price of other cereals, like in Canada would be wheat price and barley price. So if you compare to wheat and barley price, I'll be looking at what is the cost per gram of starch. So I would say, okay, wheat has 60% starch, cost per gram will be this. And I will do the same for faba bean. The cost per gram is 450 grams per kilogram. The cost would be this. And then I would make that comparison. And then for the protein, I would, again, using the standard or the usual 28%. So you have 280 grams of protein per kilogram of faba. And I will do the price divided by that and cost out my cost per gram of protein from faba as compared to soya and canola, and then make a decision if it's feasible. Many times it is, and as I was mentioning before, because faba bean provides both starch and protein, it sometimes comes in at a lower price, at a higher price than cereals or protein meals, just because it's providing both, the benefit of both. Yes.
Perfect. So I think that is everything that we have time for today. I think we could probably continue talking for another hour, but I recommend people that are interested in the faba beans and feeding this to pigs to reach out to Eduardo. So to our listeners, if you're enjoying this episode of the Swine at Canada podcast show, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with your colleagues, friends, and family. All right, so now are you ready for the final 3 questions?
It's time for our famous 3.
Swine Veterinary Partners comprises 4 well-established clinics across Canada: Precision Veterinary Services, Premier SHP, 𝗪𝗏𝗄r, Ontario, and 𝗪𝗏𝗄, Quebec.
So our first one is, what is your favorite swine-related book or resource?
I think I'm, into nutrition, so I'm all the time going for the feed tables, and we use a variety of feed tables. The NRC 2012 nutrient requirements of swine is one that we use heavily. The other one is, the table composition of nutritional value of feedstuffs from the French, from Savant and company, the French database. We also use the Dutch tables, the Brazilian tables, amino data 5. I understand there's a newer version, but I keep going back to amino data 5. So all those are resources that we use for nutrient content for the different feedstuffs. And then, some things are changing. We're learning more about fiber content. So we now have TDF, NDF, ADF, soluble fiber and insoluble fiber contents for some of the ingredients. So that's becoming available. We're also looking at formulating on the basis of standardized calcium as well as standardized phosphorus digestibility. And so we're getting that information from scientific papers and conference procedures and all that we're constantly looking at.
So what about a favorite book or research source outside of agriculture?
Well, I'm a pilot, and so I love aviation, and so I spend a lot of time on that. On my free time, I spend a lot of time looking at technical stuff in aviation, and so there are many books that I'm always reaching for. So there are many resources. There's some Canadian books that are very good. There's also a lot of American books that are excellent resources. So I'm always on the technical side of things looking at aviation books.
I shouldn't be surprised. Okay, and then the last question is, in your opinion, what sets successful swine professionals apart from those that are not?
Well, I would say innovation is one thing. People that are able to adapt and change fast, survive. So the survival of the fitness and leadership too. I think that it's not just innovation, but also leadership in the field, and we see that the producers that remain in production are true leaders in their field, and are able to establish relationships and partnerships among them and with others, and therefore remain in the industry and remain quite active. And I admire their resilience, because sometimes the pork cycle can be very nasty to them. And so I admire their resilience and steady course. They keep a steady course.
Okay, so that concludes another episode of the Swine Canada podcast show presented by 𝗺𝗫𝗏𝑥. So thanks everyone for joining today. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay updated on future episodes. So until next time, bye.